The rain had been falling since dawn, the kind of cold, unhurried Parisian rain that seemed to flatten the city's colors and press a weight upon every rooftop. By late afternoon, the gutters of the Quai des Orfèvres were running like narrow rivers, and Inspector Moreau stood by the window of his office, watching the blurred shapes of passers-by moving beneath their umbrellas. Paris looked half asleep, half haunted, a city holding its breath. And yet, somewhere beneath that curtain of rain, a man who should have been lying in a casket was walking among the living. It had begun with a telegram delivered by a trembling young clerk from the telegraph office on Rue du Louvre. No return address, no signature, only 9 words, measured and deliberate, like someone confessing with a whisper, "You buried the wrong man. He still walks the streets." Moreau read it twice, then a third time, sensing not a prank, but a pulse of something colder. Cases that began with shadows often ended with blood. And the funeral mentioned, the quiet burial in a provincial village near Orléans, was one he remembered. The widow's face had been pale with something deeper than mourning, a kind of fear. Now a dead man was said to be alive. Moreau felt an old, familiar unease slip into his thoughts, like smoke through a keyhole. Paris had seen its share of rumors, but there was a precision to this one that unsettled him. A man risen not from myth nor from superstition, but from paperwork, from identity, from the fragile certainty with which the world declares someone gone. And if that certainty was false, who profited from the lie? Who feared the truth? And whose hands were already stained? The rain beat harder against the windows, blurring the Seine into a streak of pewter. Somewhere far below, a siren echoed faintly, swallowed almost instantly by the wind. Moreau folded the telegram into his coat pocket and felt its weight as though it were an indictment. A dead man walking, a burial undone. And the suggestion that Paris, in all its sprawling streets and shuttered rooms, was about to reveal another secret it had tried to bury. If you wish to follow Inspector Moreau into the rain-soaked alleys of Paris, where truth hides behind shuttered windows and every footstep echoes with suspicion, stay close. These stories breathe better when shared. So if this world draws you in, its fog, its secrets, its human frailties, then lend your support by subscribing and keep the lantern burning with us. The rain had already seeped into everything by the time Inspector Moreau stepped out of the Quai des Orfèvres and pulled his collar up against the damp wind drifting off the Seine. It was one of those sullen Paris afternoons when the sky hung low enough to brush the rooftops, and every passing carriage left behind a wash of muddy water in the streets. Moreau slipped the folded telegram from his inner pocket and let his fingers rest on the paper a moment, feeling the slight tremor of unease it stirred in him. A dead man walking. 9 words that had managed to cut through the monotony of reports, interviews, and paperwork that had filled his week. It wasn't the first time Paris had whispered impossible things, but something about the sparse handwriting and the absence of a signature touched on a deeper instinct, the sense that someone out there was balancing precariously between fear and duty. He crossed the street toward the telegraph office on Rue du Louvre, where the trembling young clerk who had delivered the message recognized him instantly and hurried forward as if trying to steady his own nerves. The clerk insisted the sender had not spoken, had merely written the message in swift strokes and pushed it across the counter with a coin, eyes flicking repeatedly toward the door as if expecting someone to burst in. Moreau listened without interrupting, studying the man's memory as one studies a map. The only detail worth anything was a scent the clerk recalled vaguely, kerosene mixed with damp wool, which could have come from half the men in Paris on a night like this. Still, Moreau filed it away. Cases often turned on such minor threads. Back outside, the inspector made his way through the labyrinth of narrow streets leading toward the river, letting his thoughts order themselves with each step. The funeral referenced in the telegram had taken place in a small provincial village near Orléans, 2 weeks past. He had attended only because the deceased had been tied to an investigation that was slipping quietly into cold ash. Debts, a missing ledger, and a whisper of a smuggling route that never amounted to more than rumor. The man, Henri Delacour, had been found in what was reported as a freak accident, a fall from a low stone bridge at dusk, no signs of violence, no reason for doubt. Yet Moreau remembered clearly the widow's strange composure at the graveside, her eyes never once landing on the coffin as it was lowered. Some widows hid their emotions, others drowned in them. But hers had been something else entirely, like someone watching a play whose ending she already knew. The inspector boarded a late afternoon train at the Gare d'Austerlitz, sitting by a fogged window that trembled with each turn of the wheels. The countryside rolled out in shades of brown and muted green beyond the glass, fields glistening from the recent rain. Moreau let the rhythm lull his thoughts into clarity. If Delacour was alive, someone had buried another man in his place. If Delacour was dead, then someone wished to harvest mischief from a false resurrection. Neither possibility spoke of anything simple. He had seen men fake their own deaths before. Once out of cowardice, another time for love, and often for money. But for someone to claim life after burial, there had to be desperation or guilt. By the time the train pulled into the small station near the village, evening had begun to dim the landscape. The station platform smelled of damp hay and iron. Moreau stepped out, coat heavy with the absorbed weight of the Paris rain, and walked toward the village along the narrow road that wound past empty fields. The sky was a deepening gray, streaked with the last reluctant hints of light. Villages like this always seemed wrapped in a kind of secretive silence, as though life happened behind shuttered windows and closed doors rather than in the open. He passed a small chapel whose worn stone steps glistened darkly, and a bakery whose single lantern swayed in the wind. The undertaker's shop stood near the center, its facade faded, its windows clouded with dust. Moreau pushed the door open, and the scent of varnish and dry timber washed over him. The undertaker, a thin man with fingers stained from years of handling wood and cloth, looked up with a wary stiffness when he recognized the inspector. The conversation that followed simmered with evasions. The coffin had been closed by the widow's request, unusual for a non-violent death. The body had arrived already shrouded and had not been inspected beyond the bare minimum, and there had been no other present during preparation, something the undertaker tried to attribute to the widow's fragile state. But Moreau noted the man's darting eyes, the nervous tapping of his thumb against the counter, and the faint tremble in his voice that had not been there 2 weeks ago. Fear, not grief, infected this village. Leaving the undertaker, Moreau walked toward the small cemetery on the hill overlooking the valley. Fog crept low to the ground, coiling around the gravestones like a slow-moving tide. The lantern he carried cast a narrow yellow beam across the rows. When he reached Delacour's grave, he paused. The earth looked recently disturbed. Not dramatically, but enough to unsettle someone with Moreau's eye for detail. And then there was the boot print, half washed by the rain, yet still fresh enough to hold its shape. A man's boot, large, the heel slightly worn. 2 weeks after the burial, yet here was a print untouched by time until the last rainfall, which had ended this morning. Moreau crouched, letting the lantern's glow settle across it. Someone had stood here last night, possibly longer. A sharp wind cut across the cemetery, rattling the iron gate behind him. Moreau stood, scanning the shadows without alarm. Fear never served an inspector well in places like this. Only patience, only thought. He traced the edges of the grave with the lantern's beam, considering the possibility that someone had come to confirm the burial, or question it. Perhaps the widow, perhaps someone who wished Delacour to stay dead, or perhaps Delacour himself, though the notion felt theatrical even for Parisian mysteries. Still, the telegram's cold assertion lingered like a whisper. He still walks the streets. On his way back to the village inn, Moreau stopped by the widow's shuttered, House, drawn by an instinct he could not deny. No lights showed through the curtains. The gate creaked faintly when he pushed it open. A strange hush hung over the garden, as though even the plants held their breath. He approached the door and knocked once, gently. No answer. He listened, hearing nothing but the soft ticking of a clock from within. Something about the stillness pressed uneasily against him. A house of mourning should feel heavy, not hollow. This felt abandoned, as though the life inside had slipped away in the night. He turned back toward the village square, boots crunching lightly on the gravel, the night air carrying a faint scent of wood smoke. Above him, the sky had deepened into a blank, starless canopy. When he reached the inn, he paused at the threshold, casting one last look down the quiet road. Somewhere in the dark, a dog barked once, then fell silent. Moreau entered the inn, knowing sleep would not visit him easily. The day's fragments swirled in his mind. The widow's vacant house, the undertaker's restless eyes, the solitary footprint beside the grave, and the terse warning carried by that telegram. Together they formed the outline of something just beyond clarity, a truth struggling to surface. Later, as he sat by the inn's dim lamp reviewing his notes, the inspector felt again the peculiar heaviness in his chest, not of fear, but of foreknowledge. Cases like this rarely resolve themselves cleanly. He closed the notebook, set it beside the lamp, and let the rain's whisper outside lull his thoughts into stillness. Somewhere out there, a man who should have been at rest was walking through damp streets carrying secrets heavy enough to unbalance the living. And Moreau knew, with a quiet certainty, that tomorrow would bring him closer to that living ghost, and to the reason someone had tried so urgently to bury him. Moreau leaned back, eyes drifting toward the dark window. The rain had begun again, softer now, tapping lightly against the glass. Paris awaited his return, and with it, the first truth hidden beneath the soil. Inspector Moreau returned to Paris before dawn, arriving at the Gare d'Austerlitz just as the first pale threads of daylight began to loosen the darkness gripping the rooftops. The city looked washed out and half-formed in the early morning haze, as though its streets were still deciding what they intended to reveal. Thin smoke rose from chimneys along the quay, mingling with the river mist that curled across the cobblestones. Moreau walked with a steady pace toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the memory of the widow's silent house in the village heavy in his mind. There were moments in an investigation when instinct overshadowed fact, when the faintest detail rang truer than 100 declarations. Her absence, her shuttered windows, the stillness of that house, these formed a shadow over everything. He did not go to his office. Instead, he left his suitcase with the concierge and headed directly toward the widow's Paris address. Her true residence was not the provincial house where the funeral had taken place. That had been her husband's family home. The couple's life belonged here, in a quiet street near the Rue Saint-Denis, where buildings leaned gently toward one another as though sharing whispered confessions. As Moreau approached, he felt a subtle tension in the air, a sense that this place, more than the village, held the truth. The house stood modestly among taller structures, its shutters closed despite the hour. The facade bore faint traces of once bright paint, now dulled by time. Moreau paused before knocking, taking in the silence that clung to the entrance. Then he lifted his hand and rapped gently. No answer. He waited, then knocked again, firmer this time. At last, he heard the faint scrape of movement inside, followed by a hesitant, shuffling step. The door opened only a crack at first, revealing a sliver of dim interior and a single wary eye. When the door fully opened, Madame Delacour appeared with an expression that felt partly rehearsed, partly genuine. Her face was pale, too pale for someone supposedly living through only the ordinary quiet of grief. Her dark hair, loosely tied, fell unevenly across one cheek, and her hands trembled despite her attempts to keep them folded. She wore a house dress of simple fabric, though the stitching near the collar had come undone as if hastily repaired. "Inspector Moreau," she said, her voice soft, almost fragile. "I did not expect to see you." "I imagine not," he replied, stepping into the hallway as she moved aside. "Forgive the intrusion so early, madame. I returned from the village only a short while ago." The statement landed, and for the briefest moment something flickered in her gaze. Fear or recognition, he could not tell. She motioned him toward a small sitting room at the end of the corridor. The room smelled faintly of dried carnations and old kerosene, a scent that instantly evoked the provincial burial. A low fire smoldered in the grate, barely warm enough to take the chill from the air. A photograph of Henri Delacour sat upon the mantel, its frame turned slightly away from the room, as though repositioned in haste. Madame Delacour gestured toward a chair. Moreau declined, preferring to stand. He knew posture could reveal more than questions. "You did not attend to your husband's residence in the village when I visited," Moreau began. I was unwell," she replied, clasping her hands so tightly the knuckles blanched. "I have not been myself since the funeral. You did not answer when I knocked." "I did not hear you." He let the lie settle without addressing it. A widow's silence was expected, but her hesitation carried something brittle. Moreau walked slowly around the room, his eyes taking in the disorder that passed for ordinary living. Papers stacked unevenly, a half-finished cup of tea gone cold on, a side table, a shawl tossed across a chair, but beneath it all lay small inconsistencies only a trained eye would notice. A drawer left half-opened with letters inside, arranged in no coherent order. A jewelry box with its lid closed, but the key missing from its usual ribbon, and a faint indentation on the carpet near the window, as though a chair had recently been moved and hastily returned. Madame Delacour watched him with a gaze that sought to appear composed, but faltered under pressure. "You received visitors recently," Moreau observed without turning. "No," she said too quickly. "Someone has been sitting at that window." She followed his gaze and hesitated. Her fingers twitched, betraying the truth. "It was only a neighbor," she murmured. "She came to check on me." "Which neighbor?" A pause. "Madame Fournier." Moreau nodded, though he knew the answer was a fabrication. He needed only to watch her throat constrict to see it. But lies often betrayed themselves far better when allowed to breathe. He shifted his attention to the photograph on the mantel, the one turned partly away. The man in the picture, Henri Delacour, had sharp, angular features softened by a faint, reserved smile. A man who hid his intentions behind gentle manners, a man capable of deception. "Madame," Moreau began softly, "did your husband have debts?" She swallowed. "Most men have debts. But yours were significant." Silence stretched, and her eyes drifted toward the locked drawer in the corner cabinet. Moreau's gaze followed. The wood bore thin scratches around the lock. Recent ones. Whoever had tried to open it had neither patience nor skill. "May I?" he asked, though permission was a formality. She nodded, or rather, she failed to protest. Moreau opened the drawer with a slender tool from his pocket. Inside lay letters bound by a ribbon, though the knot had been retied awkwardly, suggesting they had been read recently. The first 3 letters bore affectionate tones, ordinary sentiments between spouses. But the later letters shifted. Fewer words, colder phrases, hurried instructions about travel, business matters, and unexplained absences. One letter had a small stain at the corner. Tea, perhaps, or something more human in origin. Madame Delacour watched him, her breath catching when he reached for the final letter. This one bore no signature, only a single line written in a firmer hand. "Do not follow me." Moreau folded the letters and placed them back inside. "Your husband left Paris before his death," he said. She did not answer, but her silence confirmed everything. "And you knew?" At this, her composure cracked. Her eyes welled with a mix of fear and shame, and her breathing turned shallow. She lowered herself into a chair, pressing a hand against her forehead. "I tried to stop him," she whispered. "I begged him not to leave. He said he had no choice." "What kind of choice?" She shook, her head, refusing to speak, refusing perhaps to condemn the man she still loved or feared. Moreau took a slow step closer. "Madame, I visited the grave yesterday." She stiffened. There were fresh boot prints beside it. Her hands trembled violently now. The color drained entirely from her face. "You think he—" She could not bring herself to complete the sentence. "I think," Moreau said quietly, "that someone wanted you to believe he's still alive. Or someone wanted me to." Her shoulders sagged as though a weight long carried had suddenly grown heavier. Moreau turned toward the window. The fog outside wrapped itself around the street like a muffled blanket. Something moved across the street. A faint blur, a silhouette, or perhaps only a shifting shadow. But Moreau knew shadows in Paris. Some lingered too deliberately. "You are being watched," he said calmly. She did not look shocked, only resigned. "I know," she whispered. "They have been watching for days." He faced her sharply. "Who?" She pressed her lips together, tears forming in her eyes. "I don't know, but they come at night. I hear footsteps outside my window. I hear whispers." "Did you tell anyone?" Her laugh was thin, almost broken. "Who would believe a widow who cannot sleep?" Moreau stepped to the window and stared into the street. A man in a gray overcoat stood across the road, face hidden beneath the brim of a hat. The moment Moreau's silhouette appeared behind the glass, the man turned and slipped into the fog, leaving only the faint echo of his quickened steps. Madame Delacour rose slowly, gripping the back of the chair for support. "Inspector, if Henri is alive, he will not come back, not to me, not to anyone." "Why?" Her voice trembled. "Because he feared something more than death." Moreau studied her a long moment before stepping toward the door. "Madame Delacour," he said gently, "I believe you are in danger. Keep your doors locked. Keep your curtains drawn, and if anyone approaches, anyone, you will send for me at once." She nodded, tears streaming silently. As Moreau stepped back into the gray morning light, he glanced down the street where the man in the gray coat had vanished. Paris felt colder than before, and the air carried a strange, metallic tension, like the moment before a storm breaks. A widow hiding truth, a house whispering secrets, and a shadow that did not like being seen. The fog thickened as Inspector Moreau made his way across the Pont Marie later that morning, its pale vapors rising from the Seine like memory taking form. He had left Madame Delacour's house with the lingering tremor of her fear clinging to his thoughts, and now the city seemed to echo that fear in its muted tones and shivering light. The air smelled of damp stone, coal smoke, and the faint sweetness of bakery ovens awakening for the day. Yet beneath it all, something unsettled pulsed faintly, like a distant heartbeat pressing through layers of mist. He arrived at the Quai des Orfèvres to find Janvier already waiting outside, pacing with unusual restlessness, a folded newspaper clutched in his gloved hand. The young inspector's breath formed small clouds in the cold air as he greeted Moreau. "There are reports," Janvier said without preamble. "A man answering Delacour's description was seen at the Gare d'Austerlitz late last night." Moreau paused, letting the weight of those words settle. He studied Janvier's face, searching for any hint of exaggeration, but saw only earnest concern. "Seen by whom?" Moreau asked. "A porter, and a woman waiting for the night train to Bourges." Both recalled the limp in his left leg. The limp. That was a detail only someone familiar with Delacour or his body could know. Moreau felt the faint tightening in his chest that always came when a case shifted from rumor to reality. "Did they speak to him?" he asked. Janvier shook his head. He kept his distance, always moving, never lingering in one place. "Did he board a train?" "That part is unclear," Janvier admitted. The porter thought he boarded. The woman thought he slipped out through the side entrance. Moreau considered this. A man returning from the dead would choose movement over stillness, hiding in motion, leaving half-truths in his wake. "Very well," he said. "We go there immediately." The Gare d'Austerlitz was already alive with commotion when they arrived. Porters hauling crates, steam locomotives exhaling thick clouds that wrapped around the columns like restless spirits, travelers hurrying with bags thumping against their sides. The station smelled of iron, oil, damp wool, and anticipation. It always felt to Moreau like a crossroads of stories, some beginning, some ending, and some fleeing into the twilight between truth and invention. Moreau approached the station master, who lifted his cap in recognition and led them toward the lower platform where the sighting had reportedly occurred. The wind whipped through the exposed waiting area, tugging at newspapers and rattling the lanterns that hung from the metal beams. Moreau's eyes scanned the ground, noting scuffed footprints, scattered straw from recent cargo, and a thin ribbon someone had dropped, now tangled near the tracks. The porter who claimed the first sighting appeared moments later, his face ruddy, his hands still dusted with coal from a morning shipment. He tried to hide his nervousness as Moreau questioned him. "It was him, Inspector," the porter insisted. "Or someone who looks exactly like him. The same coat, the same limp, the same way of glancing over his shoulder as if afraid of someone creeping behind him." "You knew Delacour personally?" Moreau asked calmly. "No, sir, but I saw his photograph. It was in the papers, wasn't it? The notice about his death." Moreau nodded. "Describe his behavior." The porter licked his lips, thinking. "Like a man who expected trouble." "Not from the police. No, he didn't look like he feared authority. More like he feared someone more certain. Someone who wouldn't make noise when they came for him." That phrasing struck Moreau with particular force. "And he boarded which train?" "Track 3, sir. Destination, Villeneuve-sur-Cher. A small, quiet village. A place someone could vanish in the folds of ordinary life." Before Moreau could respond, the woman who had also seen him approached, drawn by their questioning. She was middle-aged, wrapped in a shawl of muted green wool, her eyes sharp despite the early hour. "You're looking for the man in the grey coat, aren't you?" she asked. Moreau inclined his head. "If you saw him, madame, your account would be helpful." She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "He was afraid. That much was clear. He kept glancing toward the clock tower as though measuring how long he had left. And every time the wind shifted, he pulled his hat lower, as though hiding his face." "Did he carry luggage?" "A small valise. Old, worn at the corners. He held it like it contained something fragile or dangerous." Moreau exchanged a look with Janvier. "And you believe he boarded the train?" Moreau asked. Her mouth tightened. "I'm not sure. I thought I saw him step toward the last carriage, but then the steam from the engine rose so thick I lost sight of him. When it cleared, he was gone." Gone. Not confirmed boarding, not confirmed escaping, a man who wanted to be seen just enough. Janvier took notes as Moreau thanked the woman. Then Moreau stood in silence for a long moment, absorbing the rhythm of the station, the clatter of wheels, the shouts of porters, the hiss of steam. All around him, life moved with determination, and within that motion, one man, living or dead, was using the chaos as a cloak. He turned toward the ticket booth. "We searched the records," he said. Inside the booth, the pale clerk looked startled to see them but complied at once. Moreau scanned the passenger logs, his finger moving steadily down the names. Then he stopped. A ticket had been purchased for Villeneuve-sur-Cher at precisely 11:18 p.m. under the name Louis Bertrand, a name that meant nothing. But the handwriting, though altered, carried the faintest resemblance to Delacour's business signature, a detail Moreau would not have noticed had he not examined the letters at the widow's house. "Did the purchaser speak?" Moreau asked. The clerk thought for a moment. "Very little." His voice sounded hoarse, as though he had recently been ill or frightened. Moreau folded his arms, sinking deeper into thought. Delacour was not using aliases with elegance or confidence. He used them the way desperate men did, quick, clumsy, hoping speed would compensate for care. That lack of finesse suggested he was not attempting a long-term disappearance, but fleeing something immediate. "Janvier," Moreau said. "Fetch the timetables." They studied train routes pinned behind the glass, following the thread of where a man with limited time and growing fear might go. Villeneuve-sur-Cher was not a terminus. It connected to a smaller, often forgotten line leading to a cluster of remote villages known primarily for their forests and discreet, meandering rivers. Landscapes where a man could shed his identity like a snake shedding its skin. Moreau's thoughts sharpened. He's using the trains not to travel, but to confuse. To create echoes. "Echoes, sir?" Janvier asked. "Yes, sightings scattered across Paris and beyond, enough to keep those hunting him uncertain of his true direction. And us." Moreau's mouth curved slightly. "We only need one true step to find the next." He stepped out into the main terminal again, eyes drifting across the streams of passengers. Something tugged at him, a faint intuition, the subtle pull of a thread he had yet to see clearly. He moved toward the benches near the far end of the hall. Something metallic glinted beneath one of them. Moreau crouched, retrieving what looked like a ticket stub. It was creased, slightly damp, and bore the same false name. Louis Bertrand. Dropped, discarded, or left as a deliberate sign. He lifted it toward the light. The time stamp matched a train that had not even left Paris. An unused ticket, a decoy. A man fleeing for his life did not behave like this by accident. Delacour, or whoever walked in his stead, was weaving a map of misdirection. As Moreau stood, he felt suddenly that he was no longer just following a man, but stepping into the psychological terrain of someone who feared not capture, but discovery. Someone aware that Paris still carried pieces of him in its pockets, in ledgers, in memory. Someone who knew that death had been his shield, and to be seen alive now was to be hunted by more than just the law. Moreau's gaze swept across the station once more. A faint movement caught his eye, a figure slipping quietly behind a column at the opposite end of the hall. A grey coat, a lowered hat, a gait too deliberate to be casual. Moreau moved, not running but with the quiet, predatory certainty of a man who trusted his instincts. Janvier followed, weaving through the bustling travelers, but by the time they reached the column, the man had vanished into the maze of platforms. All that remained was the fading imprint of a boot on the wet stone, heel worn, just like the print of the grave. He was close now, close enough that the air trembled with it. As Moreau stood on the platform, the wind carrying the cold scent of iron and steam, he realized something with unusual clarity. The man they sought was not simply alive. He was following them as well, watching, measuring the distance, and making sure they never got close enough to touch the truth. Moreau turned slowly, scanning the crowd. Somewhere, hidden among faces, the dead man was breathing. The road to Villeneuve-sur-Cher cut through stretches of quiet countryside, a landscape stripped bare by winter and mottled by patches of stubborn fog that clung to the ground as if reluctant to let go. Inspector Moreau sat in the compartment of the provincial train, watching the fields slide past in muted tones of brown, grey, and frost-bitten green. The rhythmic clatter of the wheels on the tracks threaded through his thoughts as he tried to piece together the shape of Delacour's flight. It was no longer merely a question of whether the man was alive. The question had grown into something weightier. What did he fear so desperately that even death seemed safer than being found alive? And who else feared what his reappearance might reveal? By the time Moreau stepped onto the gravel platform of the small station, the sky had begun its slow retreat toward dusk. A thin, bitter wind swept through the village, carrying with it the sharp scent of chimney smoke and wet earth. Villeneuve-sur-Cher lay sprawled across a shallow bend in the river, its stone houses huddled close together as though sharing warmth against the cold. Narrow dirt lanes wound between them, their surfaces churned into mud by recent rain. People here did not move with the hurried anonymity of Paris. They paused, they stared, they noted strangers with caution sharpened by generations of quiet living. Moreau walked with measured steps toward the edge of the village where Janvier's information said Delacour had been seen. Though, if Delacour had ever arrived here, he had chosen a place designed to swallow a man whole. The house with the blue shutters stood apart from the others, perched slightly above the main road with a small patch of overgrown grass creeping toward its stone steps. The shutters, once painted a cheerful shade of azure, had faded under years of neglect into a muted, peeling blue that seemed almost embarrassed to draw attention. The door had a long scratch etched into its surface, the kind caused by a tool or by someone desperate. Moreau paused at the gate, listening to the silence that seeped from the house like an exhaled breath. The quiet was not ordinary. It was too complete, too watchful. He pushed the gate open with a slow, deliberate motion and stepped onto the path. A faint crunch beneath his boot drew his attention. An imprint in the soil, fresh, though partially smudged. A boot print, large. Left heel worn, just as the one near the grave had been, so the man with the grey coat had been here, and perhaps Delacour as well. The inspector approached the door and tested the handle. Locked. But provincial locks were rarely obstinate. He slipped a thin tool from his pocket, inserted it quietly, and coaxed the mechanism with practiced ease. The door gave way with a soft click, opening into a narrow hallway that smelled faintly of damp wood, stale tobacco, and something else. Something metallic and unsettling. He stepped inside. The house was cold, not the cold of neglect alone, but the cold of recent absence. A coat hung on a hook by the entrance, still damp from a journey, the fabric stiff and heavy. A pair of boots sat near the corner, caked with mud that had not yet dried fully. Moreau moved deeper into the hallway, noting the scuffed marks on the floorboards, the dust pattern slightly disturbed, the faint residue of ash on a table where a candle had burned recently. The sitting room opened to the left. Inside, the stale smell of pipe tobacco lingered in the air. Moreau recognized it immediately, the same tobacco he had smelled in the Delacour home in Paris, a blend Henri Delacour favored. On the table stood a half-burned letter, edges curled from the flame that had consumed most of it. Moreau lifted the remaining scrap carefully. Only partial words survived. Cannot risk, followed. Meet by the rest was gone. The handwriting, though hurried, bore a familiar tension in its strokes. Someone had attempted to destroy it, and had been interrupted. Moreau straightened, letting his eyes drift across the room. A chair sat askew as though pushed back suddenly. A small lamp stood cold, though oil still shimmered faintly at its base. Everything suggested haste, not the frenetic scattering of a burglar, but the concentrated urgency of someone who knew time was thinning around him. He moved toward the back of the house. The kitchen was sparse, a loaf of bread left partially sliced on the counter, crumbs scattered in a way that suggested someone had eaten standing up, ready to leave at any moment. The rear door had a faint indentation near the lock, as if someone had tested it from the outside. Moreau crouched, running his fingertips gently along the mark. Fresh. Another recent visitor. He entered the bedroom. It was neater than the rest of the house. The bed made, the wardrobe door partially open. Inside hung only a few garments, 2 shirts, a jacket, and a coat unfamiliar to Moreau, thicker and heavier than the others. What drew his attention, however, were the papers stacked beneath the bed. He pulled them into the light. Ledgers, receipts, financial records, and names. Names crossed out in pencil. Figures circled. Margins marked with hurried calculations. Moreau recognized several of the names. Small-time associates from earlier smuggling inquiries, men who had faded into obscurity when no evidence linked them to wrongdoing. And yet here they were, their names in Delacour's own hand. The ledger grew more cryptic as Moreau flipped through the pages. Symbols replaced figures, initials replaced full names. Codes only someone deeply embedded in the web would understand. One entry, however, froze Moreau in place. A single line written in large, firm strokes. Leave Paris before they decide to dig. Moreau exhaled slowly. Someone had been hunting Delacour long before his supposed death. Perhaps the burial had been his shield, his final desperate attempt to escape a fate closing around him. But then, why come here? Moreau returned to the hallway and noticed, for the first time, a faint trail on the floor, barely perceptible smudges of something darker than dirt. He followed it to a loose floorboard near the far wall. Kneeling, he pressed gently. The board shifted. Beneath it lay a small recess. A bloodstain, not large, not old. The color still bore a slight sheen. Moreau leaned closer, letting the dim light stretch across it. The stain had partially soaked into the grain of the wood. Someone had bled here. Someone who had been standing, and someone who had tried to clean it, but not thoroughly. A confrontation, or merely injury. He searched the recess further and found a torn scrap of fabric, dark gray wool, soft to the touch, the same shade as the coat worn by the man who had watched the widow's house. The same shade as the man glimpsed at the Gare d'Austerlitz. So the shadow following the clues was not Delacour. It was someone else. Someone who walked too close to the trail, whose presence caused fear wherever it appeared. Moreau stood, turning slowly toward the window. Through the warped glass, the village lay hushed, the wind rattling the branches of a nearby oak. The daylight was thinning, swallowed slowly by a dusk tinged with the faintest violet hue. He stepped closer to the window and scanned the street. Nothing. No shadow, no figure. But the house itself breathed tension. Every corner, every surface seemed touched by urgency, by the desperate effort of a man trying to erase himself. Moreau walked back into the sitting room. Something tugged at his attention again. The half-burned letter. He lifted it one more time, studying the remnants. Beneath the larger fragment lay a smaller piece he had first overlooked. He separated it gently. It bore a single line, written in a steadier hand, as though meant to anchor the writer's fear. If the river accepts me, the truth will stay buried. Moreau felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. The river. The Seine. A man seeking disappearance. But the truth never stayed buried for long. It seeped through cracks. It rose with the tide. Outside, a sudden gust rattled the shutters violently. Moreau turned instinctively. For a moment he thought he glimpsed movement through the slats. Something shifting where shadows deepened. But when he stepped outside moments later, the street was empty. Only the wind remained, sweeping through the grass around the stone steps. And yet the sensation persisted. Someone had been here, watching, waiting, measuring the inspector's progress. As Moreau locked the door behind him and stepped into the creeping dusk, he felt certain of one thing. Delacour's vanishing act had begun long before his death, and the man who knew why was either bleeding or hunting. The train back to Paris arrived well after nightfall, and when Inspector Moreau stepped onto the I platform at the Gare d'Austerlitz, The city seemed wrapped in a darker kind of quiet than usual. Fog drifted low across the Seine like a pale river, mirroring the true one below, and the lamps along the quay cast shimmering halos into the mist. Paris had many faces, but this was the one Moreau knew best, the hour when the city's sins blended with its breath, when footsteps echoed longer than they should, and the cold in the air carried whispers instead of wind. Moreau walked slowly along the riverbank, coat tightly fastened, his shoes striking a steady rhythm against the slick stone. The coded telegram he had found in the blue-shuttered house had mentioned a rendezvous by the river, though it never specified where. The Seine was long and winding, with countless corners where a man could hide or be hidden. But Moreau had learned over the years that people in danger gravitated toward the same places, those where they once felt weightless or unseen or briefly unburdened. And Henri Delacour had once frequented this part of the river in the late evenings, smoking cheap tobacco by the stone steps leading down to the water near the Pont Marie. The inspector's coat pocket held the scrap of letter from the house. "If the river accepts me, the truth will stay buried." The words gnawed at him like a half-formed confession. Street lamps flickered as he walked beneath them, their yellow glow bending through the thick air. Barges drifted lazily, their lanterns dim, their engines humming with tired persistence. Somewhere farther upriver, a boat horn sounded, a long, mournful note that faded into the fog like a final breath. As he neared the old stone steps, Moreau's pace slowed. A faint shape moved at the river's edge. Not a man, just the shifting silhouette of a stray dog searching among discarded scraps. But then, behind it, he saw something else, a faint indentation in the mud. Moreau knelt carefully, shining his pocket lantern down. There it was again. The same boot print, large, with the worn left heel deepened by the moisture in the ground. The man with the grey coat had been here, and not long ago. Moreau stood slowly, scanning the fog-choked walkway. A feeling crept up his spine, not of danger exactly, but of being drawn into someone else's rhythm, someone who was always one step ahead, leaving just enough trace to tempt pursuit. He continued along the river until he reached a small arch beneath the Pont Marie where the shadows hung thicker. A young man in a cap leaned against the wall, cigarette flickering between trembling fingers. The smell of cheap tobacco mingled with the cold air. "You should be at home at this hour," Moreau said quietly. The man startled, dropping the cigarette. It hissed out on the wet stones. "I ain't doing nothing wrong," he mumbled, eyes darting nervously. "I didn't say you were, but you saw something here tonight." The man hesitated, shifting on his feet. The inspector waited. Silence had always been the best coaxer of truth. Finally, the young man exhaled in resignation. "All right, I saw someone. A man, tallish, grey coat. Stayed near the steps for a long time, just watching the water. Kept looking over his shoulder too, like someone might come for him." "Did he speak to anyone?" "No, sir, but someone came to him." This tightened Moreau's attention. "Describe them." The young man shook his head. Couldn't see the face, all wrapped up in a dark cloak. "They didn't talk neither, just passed something. A parcel. Small." He put it in his pocket and walked off. "Which direction?" "Downstream, toward the warehouses." Moreau nodded slowly. "What made you stay to watch?" The man hesitated again. His voice dropped. "Because the one in the grey coat, he kept looking at the water like he was saying goodbye to it." A shiver moved across the inspector's shoulders. He pressed a coin into the young man's hand and walked away, the sound of the man's rapid footsteps fading behind him. The river narrowed as he followed the path downstream, the stone walls growing more uneven, the fog thicker. His senses sharpened. He felt the rhythm of the city shift, its pulse tightening as he approached the cluster of warehouses that loomed ahead like silhouettes carved from shadow. Warehouses along the Seine always had their secrets. They were the places where goods entered Paris quietly, without paperwork. They were the places where debts were collected, and more often than anyone admitted, they were where men disappeared. Moreau slowed near a warehouse whose rusted metal number plate, 14, hung crookedly by a single nail. Faint light flickered through a crack beneath the door. The inspector stepped closer, listening. Footsteps inside. 2 sets, one calm, one pacing. Voices. The first voice was smooth. Too smooth. A man accustomed to hiding sharpness behind civility. "You should have stayed dead," it murmured. The second voice, tired, raw, answered with trembling defiance. "I tried." Moreau's pulse quickened, but he remained silent, one hand instinctively moving toward the pocket where his revolver rested. "You think you can run forever?" the smooth voice continued. "All you've done is make it worse." "I didn't take anything," the second voice insisted. I just knew too much." There was a crack, the sound of something being struck. A muffled cry followed. Moreau didn't wait. He stepped back, scanned the surroundings, and found a narrow side entrance partially blocked by crates. With careful precision, he slid through the gap, the faint smell of mold and grain filling his nostrils as he entered the dim interior. The warehouse was a cavernous, shadowed hole broken by pillars and stacks of aging crates. Lantern light flickered from the far end where 2 figures stood, one towering, the other slumped against a pillar. The slumped man looked gaunt, clothes soaked, hair matted. Even from a distance, Moreau felt the recognition strike him like a cold wind across the spine. Henri Delacour. Alive. The second man, the smooth-voiced one, lifted something gleaming in the lantern light, a long, narrow blade, meant not for show, but for finality. "Too much truth is dangerous, Henri," he said softly. "For you, and for her. For her. The widow." Moreau stepped from behind the crates, revolver drawn. "Enough." The blade dropped slightly, surprise rippling across the assailant's posture. Delacour looked up with wide, hollow eyes that carried weeks of fear. "Inspector," he whispered, the word trembling through the vast space. The assailant recovered quickly. "You should not be here, Moreau. You are trespassing in affairs that do not concern you." "The affairs of the dead," Moreau replied, voice low and steady, "always concern me when they start walking." A tense silence settled. Then, with a sudden shift in weight, the assailant lunged, not at Moreau, but toward a narrow corridor leading deeper into the warehouse. Moreau fired, the bullet sparking against metal as the man vanished into the dark. "Stop!" Moreau called, but the warehouse swallowed the command. He rushed to Delacour instead, helping him stand. The man swayed like someone whose legs had forgotten their purpose. "You came," Delacour whispered, disbelief etched into his voice. "You made that necessary," Moreau answered. "You have a habit of leaving corpses in your place." Delacour shook his head weakly. "I didn't choose this. I didn't choose any of it." "Then you will explain." But before Delacour could respond, a sharp sound echoed through the warehouse. A distant slam of a door. The assailant was not running. He was circling. Moreau tightened his grip on the revolver and pulled Delacour behind a stack of crates. "Tell me," Moreau whispered urgently. "Who does this involve? Who are you meeting? Who fears you alive?" Delacour's breath shuddered and his voice cracked. "It's not just one man," he murmured. "It's a whole chain, and breaking one link means the others come for you." "What chain?" Moreau pressed. Delacour met his gaze with eyes filled with a terrible, exhausted certainty. "The chain that buries truths in coffins, even when the bodies aren't there." Before Moreau could unravel that cryptic confession, another sound rippled through the shadows, a heavy boot step, deliberate, controlled, the worn left heel. Moreau's blood turned cold. The man with the grey coat was inside, and he was not fleeing anymore. He was hunting. They left the warehouse by a side door that opened onto a narrow lane choked with mist, the air smelling of damp rope and old cheese from a shuttered shop nearby. Moreau kept a firm grip on Delacour's arm, half guiding, half dragging him along the uneven stones. Behind them, the metal door creaked once and fell silent, as though the building had swallowed its own secrets again. Somewhere within that darkness, the man with the smooth voice and the worn left heel was either slipping away into the veins of the city or watching them vanish into the fog. Either possibility sent a dull tension through the inspector's shoulders. Delacour shivered inside his frayed coat, the collar darkened by sweat and river damp. Even in the poor light of the gas lamps, his face looked older than his years, the skin stretched too tightly over his cheekbones, the eyes sunk deep in their sockets. A man who had been living among shadows and found them poor company. At the Quai des Orfèvres, Janvier stared when Moreau appeared with the supposed dead man at his side. The lamp on the inspector's desk cast a pool of golden light over the room, illuminating the lines etched around Moreau's mouth and the dirt on Delacour's cuffs. Outside, the rain had returned in hesitant drops that traced erratic paths down the glass. "You were buried," Janvier murmured quietly, as if afraid the words might undo whatever fragile reality stood in front of him. Delacour's lips twisted into something between a grimace and a smile. "Paris is fond of illusions," he said in a hoarse whisper. "Sometimes it buries its problems before they've stopped breathing." Moreau gestured Janvier to close the door, then motioned Delacour to sit. The man sank into the chair as though his bones no longer trusted their own weight. "You will tell us everything," Moreau said calmly. "Not in fragments, not in half-truths. You have already died once. There is no room left for omissions." Delacour rubbed his hands together, as though trying to warm them on a fire that was no longer there. "They made me a proposal," he began slowly. "Months ago. I managed certain accounts, nothing grand, small firms, shipping consignments, occasional transfers. Enough to keep a modest life. Enough to keep my wife in the illusion that we were safe. Then the numbers started changing. Cargoes began to arrive with no official manifests. Money passed through accounts that belonged to men who did not exist. I asked questions, the wrong questions." "Who came to you?" Moreau asked. "A man I'd never seen before," Delacour said. His eyes drifted toward the window, where the lamplight trembled faintly. He had the kind of voice that turns threats into suggestions. He explained that discretion could be more profitable than honesty, that there were those who preferred to remain unnamed in certain transactions. "The man at the warehouse?" Moreau pressed. Delacour nodded. "Him, or someone like him. It's hard to tell with men who have no real faces." "And you refused?" "Not at first," Delacour admitted, shame coloring his cheeks. "I thought I could manage both. Keep my position, protect my wife, and dabble only enough to satisfy them. But once you begin swallowing their secrets, they start to lodge in your throat. I tried to step away. That was when the accidents began. A crate nearly crushed me at the docks. A horse bolted toward me in the street. Small things, they would say. Coincidence. But I understood." "So you decided to die?" Moreau said quietly. The words hung in the air with their own peculiar weight. "Better a grave than a river," Delacour murmured. "The river gives things back sometimes. Graves do not. Yet here you are," Janvier said. Delacour gave a hollow laugh. "Yes, here I am, a man who failed at being dead." They questioned him for hours, drawing out the structure of the network in halting strokes. Shell companies, unregistered shipments that passed through forgotten corners of provincial stations, anonymous letters that arrived without names but with unmistakable authority. A chain that wound quietly around the city's underbelly, tightening whenever someone tugged too hard on it. But whenever Moreau pressed for names, Delacour's certainty faltered. He knew faces, voices, gestures, not identities. Men who entered cafes through back doors and left by side alleys. Men whose coats had no distinguishing marks except perhaps a worn heel on the left boot. It was nearly dawn when Moreau finally rose, his back stiff, his eyes gritty with fatigue. He ordered Delacour placed in a small holding room, not for formality but for protection. A man who had enemies willing to stage his death did not belong in an ordinary bed. When Moreau stepped back out onto the quay, the city had slipped into that strange in-between hour where even Paris seemed to blink sleepily. The fog had thinned slightly, revealing the dark, slow surface of the Seine carrying its secrets downstream. A newspaper boy hurried past, his arms loaded with folded stacks that still held the chill of the printing house. By midday, the first rumors had already taken shape. At a cafe near the Rue de Rivoli, journalists gathered with ink-stained fingers and restless eyes. The story of a man rumored to have walked away from his own burial passed from table to table, changing slightly each time it was told. Some said he had been seen stepping out of his coffin in the dead of night. Others whispered that he had been buried alive and clawed his way back through the soil. A few more pragmatic voices insisted it was all the result of a bureaucratic error, the sort the city excelled at producing. An article appeared in an evening paper, thinly veiled as speculation. Is Paris harboring a man returned from the grave? It spoke of record-keeping mistakes, of rural incompetence, but between the lines it hinted at something darker. Identities stolen, lives rearranged, and a hidden economy built on the quiet reshuffling of the dead and the living. Moreau read it at his desk, the corner of the paper trembling slightly between his fingers. The piece did not mention Delacour by name, but the implication was clear enough to anyone who cared to squint. Someone had allowed this rumor to bloom. Perhaps they thought it would flush him out. Perhaps they wanted to sap public confidence in the institutions charged with safeguarding the line between life and death. He closed the paper and looked out the window at the gray river sliding past. The fog had thickened again along the opposite bank, wrapping buildings in a gauzy, indifferent veil. Another note awaited him on his desk when he returned from a brief consultation with the examining magistrate. No signature, no ornament, just one line, written in the same steady hand that had dispatched the first telegram: "The more you pull, Moreau, the more coffins will open." It was not a threat so much as a statement of fact, or perhaps a promise. Word of the case trickled into the cafes where clerks and minor officials drank their weak wine after work. They speculated about corruption, about identity theft, about bodies disappearing from hospitals before their names reached the registry. Some invoked conspiracies that stretched to ministers and magistrates. Others blamed foreign elements, thieves in the night, even secret societies that trafficked in documents rather than contraband. Truth and fiction intermingled freely, clotting into a murky paste. None of them knew that, in a quiet room behind a locked door at the Quai des Orfèvres, the man at the center of their fantasies lay on a narrow cot staring at the ceiling. Delacour's thoughts were full not of grand intrigue but of smaller, more intimate failures. The way his wife's hands had trembled at dinner when he first confessed his debts, the silence that had stretched between them when he returned late with the smell of unfamiliar tobacco on his clothes, the look in her eyes at the funeral, too composed, too distant, as if she were burying not a husband, but the hope that he might one day be honest with her. By late afternoon, another rumor reached Moreau's ears through an old acquaintance at a press agency. There was talk that Delacour's death had originally been tied to a minor scandal involving certain shipments that never reached their official destination. The scandal had been hushed almost before it began. Papers went missing. Witnesses forgot what they had seen. The story died not because it lacked teeth, but because someone placed a strong hand over its mouth. Now, with the suggestion that the dead man at the center of it was still alive, those buried whispers began to stir again. In the evening, as the lamps along the Seine flickered to life one by one, Moreau walked alone toward a cafe near the Pont Neuf, where informants of varying reliability liked to gather. The interior was warm and smoky, filled with the scent of roasted coffee and damp wool. Men hunched over small tables, talking in low voices, gesturing with cigarettes and cups. He did not need to ask. The rumors reached him without effort. "They say he changed places with another body," one man murmured, leaning close to his companion. "Some poor devil pulled from the river with no papers, no name, given one instead of a pauper's grave." "They say there's an entire trade in it," another added. "People who vanish on paper while their real lives go on elsewhere." "A myth," muttered a third. "Like ghosts on the boulevard. Stories to frighten children." "But children don't sign ledgers," came the reply. Moreau listened, expression thoughtful, fingers absently tracing the rim of his untouched cup. Stories born in cafes were rarely accurate, but they revealed something more important: the shape of the fears the city carried. And right now, Paris feared not only that one man had cheated the grave, but that the boundary between the registry and reality had grown dangerously porous. As he left the cafe, stepping back into the cool night air, a movement across the street caught his eye. A man in a grey coat stood in the mouth of an alley, hat pulled low, the faint glow of a cigarette ember marking his presence. The same stillness, the same patient watchfulness. Moreau turned fully toward him. Neither moved for a heartbeat. The city seemed to draw in a slow, quiet breath. Then a carriage rumbled past, briefly cutting the line of sight. When it passed, the alley was empty. Only a thin thread of smoke curled upward, dissolving into the fog. The inspector stood there a long moment, listening to the fading echo of the wheels on the cobblestones. He knew now that whatever chain Delacour had stumbled into stretched farther than provincial stations and warehouse doors. It crossed the river and passed through salons, offices, drawing rooms, the rooms where decisions were made in whispers and recorded in ledgers that never met the public eye. The rumors in the press were like fog, obscuring as much as they revealed. Yet they had one virtue. They forced those who preferred darkness to shift, to adjust, to make mistakes. Moreau turned back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, the mist curling around his shoulders like a damp shawl. Somewhere behind him in the maze of alleys, the man with the grey coat was also walking, measuring his steps, perhaps already having decided which coffin should open next. The inspector felt, for the first time in days, that the case had ceased to belong only to him. It had slipped into the city itself now, into its gossip, its fears, its sleeplessness. And when a city like Paris began to dream about the dead walking, it rarely woke without sacrifice. The night pressed heavily against the windows of the Quai des Orfèvres, a night so still it seemed to wait for something to break its silence. Inspector Moreau stood alone in the corridor outside the holding room where Henri Delacour rested uneasily on the narrow cot. Two guards sat nearby, speaking in low murmurs, their voices swallowed by the thick air of anticipation that clung to the building. Moreau checked the lock on the door, again, not out of distrust for the guards, but because there were forces moving in the city now that no lock could fully restrain. The man with the grey coat had followed them across districts, across the river, across the fragile division between the living and the dead. And if he had one virtue, it was persistence. Moreau stepped into his office and closed the door softly behind him. The lamp cast a warm glow across the scattered notes on his desk, illuminating the uneven handwriting in Delacour's ledgers, the coded symbols, the lists of shipments that arrived without names. He had arranged the pages in an order he hoped might reveal a pattern, but the result was still a tangle, a labyrinth of numbers and half-truths. At its center stood a man chased by a chain of invisible hands. He sat down, rubbing his temples as he reviewed the report from the magistrate. It was cautious, almost evasive, stressing that without confirmed identities or direct evidence, any formal charge remained out of reach. The magistrate had written one particular line in a way that disturbed Moreau. If the man believed dead wishes to remain so, perhaps we should let him. Moreau's instinct recoiled at the suggestion. Truth did not bend itself to convenience, and the dead had already had their say. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Janvier entered quietly, shutting the door behind him. "Inspector," he said, lowering his voice, "news from the prefect's office. They've issued a statement denying all rumors. Claims there is no man returned from the grave, and that the papers are stirring nonsense." Moreau leaned back, studying Janvier's expression. "And what do you believe?" "I believe," Janvier said carefully, "that when the prefect denies something so directly, it means someone above him is frightened." Moreau nodded. "Frightened men leave trails, even when they think they don't." Janvier hesitated before adding, "There's more, sir. A certain Monsieur Rouel from the Ministry of Commerce has requested a meeting with you. Tonight." "So late?" He insisted, said it was urgent. Moreau felt a faint chill along his spine. Urgent requests from ministries never arrived without a price, and seldom so late unless someone hoped the darkness would absorb what daylight might reveal. "Where?" Moreau asked. "At his office near the Boulevard Saint-Germain." Moreau stood, taking his coat and hat. "Tell the guards to stay alert. No one enters that room without my authority." Janvier nodded firmly. "Understood." The ministry building sat like a silent monolith along the boulevard, its stone facade glistening faintly in the light drizzle. Moreau climbed the wide steps and was greeted by an attendant who whisked him down a long corridor lined with portraits of former ministers whose eyes seemed to follow the intruder passing through their domain. Monsieur Rouel waited in an office that smelled faintly of cigar smoke and polished mahogany. He was a man of early middle age, impeccably dressed, with a gaze that had learned to conceal more than it revealed. He gestured for Moreau to sit. "Inspector," Rouel began, folding his hands neatly on the desk, "you have placed yourself in the midst of a very delicate situation." "Then perhaps you should tell me the shape of this delicacy," Moreau replied. Rouel's lips curved politely. "There are matters of commerce," he said, "that require discretion, shipments that pass through unexamined to ensure efficiency, certain transactions that benefit the city, though they do not always follow the strict letter of procedure. Men like your Delacour assist in smoothing these processes." "Men like him," Moreau repeated quietly. "Yes, accountants, brokers, clerks with keen numerical sense and flexible loyalties. Their work is not criminal, Inspector, merely inconvenient for those who insist on rigid transparency." "Transparency protects the living," Moreau countered. "Secrecy protects the dead." Rouel's expression tightened. "Your tone borders on inappropriate." "My work often does." A faint flush rose on the official's cheeks, but he maintained composure. "Let me be blunt," Rouel said. "Henri Delacour had information that does not belong to him. It belongs to the ministries, to the city. That ledger you confiscated has the potential to disrupt relationships that support the economic health of France. Or undermine them," Moreau said flatly. "Depending on who reads it." Rouel leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Delacour was not meant to survive. His burial solved a difficult problem. His resurrection complicates matters. If he were to speak, Inspector, he could end the careers of men far more powerful than you. Men who will not hesitate to protect themselves." Moreau's jaw tightened. "Is that a warning?" Rouel smiled faintly. "A courtesy." "And the man with the grey coat?" Moreau asked. Rouel's face remained a mask. Too still, too prepared. "I do not know whom you mean." "Then you know too little of your own house," Moreau replied. For the first time, Rouel's composure fractured slightly. He tapped his fingers against the desk. "Leave this matter, Inspector. Turn your attention elsewhere. We will handle Delacour." "Handle him how?" Moreau asked. Rouel rose. You are dismissed. Moreau stood as well, matching the man's height. I will not bury a living man because it is convenient, he said calmly. Nor will I permit others to silence truth with dirt and coffin wood. Ruel exhaled sharply. Your idealism is admirable and dangerous. Moreau left without responding. When he returned to the Quai des Orfèvres, the lamps were burning low. The guards sat stiffly in their chairs. Moreau glanced toward the holding room and felt the cold grip of dread. The door was ajar. He moved quickly, pushing it open. The cot was empty, the blanket rumpled, the pillow still indented. A half-drop of blood stained the floor near the leg of the bed. He asked for water. One of the guards stammered. I stepped away for just a moment, only to the end of the corridor. When I returned, Moreau lifted his hand for silence. A faint breeze drifted through the small barred window. He crossed the room and saw something tucked into the corner of the sill. A piece of paper, torn from the bottom of a ledger page. Delacour's handwriting, ragged, rushed. They found me. Do not look for me. Protect her. Her. Madame Delacour. Moreau's breath caught. The man who had refused to die was still trying to protect someone he had already failed too many times. He moved swiftly through the hallway, coat flapping behind him, Janvier rushing up as he called out. Sir, what's happened? They have him, Moreau said, and they will go after the widow next. Janvier paled. The man in the grey coat knows exactly where she lives. Moreau finished. The inspector stepped into the night, his stride sharp, each footstep striking the stones with relentless urgency. The fog had thickened again, curling around the gas lamps, muting the city's shape. Paris breathed heavily, uneasily. The man who refused to die was out there, dragging behind him the weight of secrets powerful men would kill to preserve. And now, the next coffin was already being prepared. The cab cut through the fog like a dark wedge, its wheels hissing against the wet stones as it hurried toward the Rue Saint-Denis. Inspector Moreau leaned forward in his seat, watching the blurred facades of buildings drift past. The city felt altered tonight, as if the fog had thickened to muffle not only sound, but truth itself. Paris often wore disguises after midnight, but this night felt different. Something in the air carried the weight of inevitability. Madame Delacour's house came into view. A narrow structure pressed between taller neighbors, its windows dark, its shutters tight. The cab had not yet stopped when Moreau stepped down, boots splashing into a shallow puddle. The street lay empty except for the wavering glow of a single lamp-post. The silence was so complete it felt engineered, as though the city had withdrawn all witnesses. Moreau paused, listening. No footsteps, no carriage wheels, no whispered arguments from shuttered windows, only the faint drip of water from a rain spout and the beating of his own pulse. He walked up the garden path. The gate, which had creaked on his earlier visit, now swung silently. Too silently. He reached the door. It was not locked. The inspector slipped inside. The air carried the cold scent of extinguished kerosene and a faint perfume. Violets, faint and trembling. The sitting room looked unchanged at first glance. The faded wallpaper, the mantel with its crooked photograph, the small stack of letters hidden in the drawer. But a detail struck him like a knife. The overturned cup on the floor, its porcelain cracked, tea still wet on the boards. Moreau scanned the hallway. The door at the end stood ajar, trembling slightly as though touched by a draft. He walked toward it with controlled steps, every sense sharpened. His hand hovered near the revolver in his pocket. Inside the back room, the scene revealed itself in fragments. A chair pushed violently aside, a shawl on the floor, one corner torn, a kerosene lamp knocked onto its side but not broken, and on the far wall, a faint smear of something darker than shadow. Blood. Fresh. Moreau knelt beside it. The smear was small, as though someone had been pulled abruptly, striking their head against the wall. He rose, jaw tightening. They had taken her. Delacour said to protect her, he whispered under his breath. And they knew that. He stood completely still, forcing his heartbeat to slow. Fear clouded the mind. Clarity required stillness. He traced the sequence of events: entry from the back door, quick scuffle, removal through the alley. No neighbors disturbed. Professional, efficient. They didn't want a scene. They wanted silence. A slip of paper lay beneath the shawl. Moreau picked it up carefully. A single address, written in a familiar hand. Quai des Cendres, Warehouse 7. The same handwriting as the earlier telegrams. Not Delacour's. Someone guiding him or toying with him. A puppeteer pulling strings from within the fog. Moreau left the house quickly, locking the door behind him, though he knew it was meaningless. The cab had waited, perhaps sensing the inspector would not linger. He climbed in and gave the address in a voice that admitted no hesitation. As they rolled through the city, a memory tugged at Moreau, his last conversation with Madame Delacour. The way her eyes darted at the mention of footsteps outside her window, the tremor in her voice when she said they were watching her. She had lived in fear long before tonight, and the ones hunting Delacour wanted her, not because she knew too much, but because she knew just enough. The Quai des Cendres stretched along a forgotten section of the Seine, its warehouses hugging the river like hulking beasts asleep in the dark. Barges seldom docked here now. Commerce had moved elsewhere, but the warehouses still stood, silent tombs for things Paris wished to forget. Warehouse 7 waited at the far end, its door half open, a wedge of pale light cutting across the stones. The cab driver hesitated. "Shall I wait, monsieur?" "No," Moreau said quietly. "Go." The cab pulled away. The inspector approached the warehouse with slow, deliberate steps. He paused by the doorway, listening. A faint voice. A woman's voice. "Madame Delacour." "Please, I don't know anything." Another voice. Low, steady, unmistakably the smooth voice from the earlier confrontation. "You know enough," he replied. Moreau stepped inside. The warehouse opened into a cavernous expanse lit only by a single lantern placed on a crate. The shadows seemed to breathe, shifting with the faint drafts. Near the center, Madame Delacour sat bound to a chair, hair disheveled, cheeks streaked with tears. Standing beside her was the man with the gray coat, hat removed now, revealing sharp features, a jaw set like stone and eyes devoid of hesitation. Beside him stood a second figure, the smooth-voiced man from before. Both turned as Moreau entered. "I was expecting you," the smooth-voiced man said. Moreau kept his hand at his coat pocket but did not draw the revolver yet. "You have her," Moreau said. "Let her go." "She is leverage," the smooth man replied. "Delacour has become unpredictable. Men who refuse to stay dead rarely behave rationally." Moreau took a step closer. "Delacour is no longer your problem. He's mine." "On the contrary," the man said, "he is the problem. A ledger's keeper who discovered the wrong entries. A man who saw names he was never meant to read." "And the other body?" Moreau asked quietly. "The one buried in his place?" A flicker, just a flicker, crossed the man's expression. "A necessary substitution," he said. "A nameless man from the river. No one mourns those who float ashore." "Someone must have," Moreau replied, "or he would not have found his way into a coffin." The smooth man shrugged. "It's how the world works, Inspector. Some lives weigh more, some less. Paper decides, not men." Madame Delacour sobbed softly at the words. Moreau moved another step forward. "That ledger," he said, "was never yours to bury. And you think revealing it will purify the city?" The man scoffed. "Nothing in Paris is ever purged. It is only rearranged, buried, forgotten. Coffins close, coffins open. The earth is patient." "You orchestrated Delacour's death," Moreau said, voice steady. "We orchestrated his disappearance. the man corrected. Death was merely a convenient disguise, until he proved unwilling to stay inside it. Moreau's gaze flickered to Madame Delacour. Her lips moved, forming a single word. "Run." He shook his head subtly. Then he spoke aloud. "Where is Delacour now?" The man with the grey coat answered. His voice was quiet, almost gentle. "Closer than you think." A sound echoed behind Moreau, a soft scrape. He turned sharply, expecting a third assailant. But it was Delacour, stumbling, blood at his temple, breath ragged. He had followed Moreau, or crawled, or escaped through sheer desperation. "Henri?" Madame Delacour whispered, horror and love twisting her voice. Delacour lifted a trembling hand. "Don't hurt her." The grey-coated man moved. Too fast. Moreau drew his revolver, firing once. The shot ricocheted off a beam. The lantern flickered violently. Shadows fractured. Chaos erupted. The smooth-voiced man lunged toward Delacour. Moreau intercepted him, slamming him against a crate. The grey-coated man drew a blade, advancing toward Madame Delacour. Moreau fired again. This time the bullet struck the man's shoulder. He staggered but did not fall, blade trembling in his hand. Delacour, with a last reserve of strength, threw himself between the man and his wife. The blade sank. Madame Delacour cried out. Moreau tackled the assailant. The blade clattered across the floor. Blood pooled beneath Delacour's collapsed body. The grey-coated man tried to rise. Moreau struck him once, forcing him down. The smooth-voiced man attempted to escape, but Janvier burst through the warehouse door, calling for backup, blocking the exit. When silence finally settled, the lantern cast an eerie glow across the scene. Madame Delacour knelt beside her husband, cradling his head in trembling hands. His breathing was shallow. His eyes sought Moreau's. "I only wanted her safe," he whispered. "You did what you could," Moreau said softly. Delacour tried to speak again, but the words dissolved into the cold air. His body stilled. Madame Delacour let out a sound that was not quite a sob, not quite a scream, something raw, more human. Moreau closed Delacour's eyes. Later, when the assailants were in custody, when statements were taken, when the magistrate had been roused from his warm home to hear the whole sordid truth, Moreau stood alone outside the warehouse. Dawn was beginning to warm the horizon. A barge drifted along the river, its lantern glowing faintly, carrying its unseen cargo toward some distant unknown. Paris was waking, a city that felt somehow unchanged by what had happened. A city that swallowed secrets and spat out rumors. A city that shifted its shadows, but never lost them. Moreau watched the barge disappear into the mist. A chill wind brushed past him, carrying the faint scent of river water and smoke. Behind him, an officer approached. "Inspector, will the report mention the substitution, the burial?" Moreau did not turn. "The report," he said softly, "will mention the truth. And the rest?" Moreau looked toward the river. "The rest," he said, "will settle where the Seine chooses to take it." He walked back toward the Quai des Orfèvres, coat swinging with each step, the fog parting before him. The city behind him continued breathing, and somewhere beneath that breath lay the unspoken truth. Some burials never truly end. They shift, they wait, they rise again. The dead walk in Paris, but only long enough to tell their story